can see them, right?
Well, I can see you, and I see possibly my background in the big screen at the top.
The sound is not very clear.
No.
Can we do something about that? Let's see. Just a minute. Is that heel laag?
Ah ja.
I can see you all.
Yeah, and there's a few people watching online.
Okay.
This sounds better.
No, just put it to like this.
Okay, just for now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So welcome, and I'm really glad that you were able to make it to our meeting, given all the things you had to do yesterday and flying in from Washington, etc. So thanks for making the time to be with us. And welcome. Yeah, welcome to this studio. So the people that you are seeing are the participants in the +2.5 degrees city studio that we are doing. Well, we are focusing on Rotterdam in about 50 years from now, and looking at, well, we're not too positive, you could say, so we're assuming that there will be a degree of 2.5, a rise of 2.5 degrees of the climate around the world, and we're looking at the consequences of that change for the city of Rotterdam. On how will we live in the city, what will we eat, how will we travel, what will our work be, what is the political system, etc. And our guide to start with for this question of what will a city look like and feel like and be like to live in when it is so warm was, of course, your book. That we will talk about. So therefore we're really happy that you're here. So let me introduce you shortly. Who is Mark Lynas? Well, or at least what is your professional background? Born in Fiji, quite interested in this, interesting in this context. Studied in the UK, history and politics. I also read that you are the co-founder of the pro-science environmental campaign network Replanet, which is active in 15 countries. I also thought it was interesting that you would use this term, pro-science environmentalist, and that you were one of the signatories of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. We've been talking about these different attitudes towards the climate change quite a lot, Eco-Modernist being one of them. And you are most known as the author of numerous books and articles on the climate for a broad audience, I should say, which started in 2004 with the book High Tide, a time travel into the future in which the tides are rising, in which nations and islands are being engulfed, deserts are growing, glaciers melting and disappearing, and everything having to do with water and climate change. And interesting and quite controversial, I think, are your next two books, which were published in 2013, the first in 2018. The first one is Nuclear 2.0, subtitled Why a Green Future Needs Nuclear Power. So that's pleading for the use of nuclear power to prevent the climate change from getting out of bounds. And in 2018 you published Seeds of Science, Why We Got It So Wrong on GMOs. And of course that's also quite controversial subject in environmental circles. I think we will probably talk about that a little bit, because I guess when you say that you're pro-science, you want to position yourself in a certain way as in regards to other environmentalists. That position also underlies the 6 Degrees book. That was originally published in 2007. It was translated in 22 languages, quite impressive, and yeah. But now it has been completely reworked and updated to, well, the book that I just showed, Our Final Warning, 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency. And the structure of it is very clear, 6 chapters, each 1 degree. And the whole idea that underlies the book, I think, is very interesting. So like 1 degree or 2 degrees, it seems like nothing, but what does it actually mean? What will happen to our mountains, glaciers, Arctic, the deserts, the Amazon, to our food, etc. And we especially also like what you have written in your introduction, that that you spent years combing through long forgotten issues of obscure glaciological journals, and days lost in the small print of the citations of the IPCC reports, and that you have processed all these hundreds or thousands of scientific papers, also that we don't have to. So I would say thanks in advance for that. And yeah, I would like to give the word to you for a talk on especially these degrees, rise in climate change, and what does it mean. And also we would like, maybe you can start with that, maybe you can, we were also very curious what your travel to Washington actually meant, and if you have been talking to some influential people, so maybe you can shed a light on that as well.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. First of all, just to check that you're hearing me okay still?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that's good. Now I can see you all, even if you look a bit dark, but that's okay. Hello again. Yeah, so I'm a bit jet lagged because I only got in from my Washington flight at 9 o'clock last night, and only got back home at about 1 in the morning. With obviously the time zone difference, it does knock you around a bit, but I also have to deal with various people texting me sarcastic things about my carbon footprint. So I do a lot of explaining about what my actual stops were there. And I had 2 things in particular. The first, I was there for about 10 days. The first week I spent mostly with the Climate Vulnerable Forum. So that's one of the jobs that I do, working as advisor to former President Nasheed of the Maldives, who was one of the kind of original climate champions, starting back in COP, whatever it was, in Copenhagen in 2009. He famously did the underwater cabinet meeting where he got his whole cabinet in scuba gear and held a cabinet meeting under the sea in the Maldives, to obviously kind of as a symbolic showcasing for the threat that sea level rise poses to that country. And he's now a leader of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is 58 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, which includes many of the least developed countries, the small island states, African countries, and so on. So these are nations which are really in the front line of the climate crisis, not just because they tend to be in tropical places, they're exposed to extreme weather, sea level rise, and so on, but really also because of their lack of adaptive capacity, because these are countries with less resources, they're less developed, and so they're less able to withstand the shocks that come with climate damages. And we're actually at the spring meetings of the IMF World Bank, and in particular putting the case to the head of the IMF in a speech that I wrote for Nasheed about the need to cancel, or at least very least restructure the debts of many of these climate vulnerable countries, which are on the verge of bankruptcy, not just because of the sort of the changes in the world financial situation, but also because of the climate damages that they're experiencing in their own economies. And so you have a very kind of inequitable situation where these countries collectively owe $500 billion to the creditor nations, to the high income nations, whereas that's just obviously in conventional financial terms. Whereas the reality of the situation is also in climate terms that about $500 billion of climate damages have occurred in these countries' economies since about 2000. So that, you know, look at the unfairness of the situation, that the rich countries have caused $500 billion climate damages, and they're charging these countries $500 billion in debt repayments at the same time. And so we asked the question, who owes who in this situation? You know, who's the creditor and who's the debtor? Because the high income countries, you know, Netherlands among them and UK as well, are the ones who owe the least developed countries for having taken up their fair shares to the atmosphere through the historical responsibility for all of the carbon that's accumulated in the atmosphere and is now causing those climate damages. So that's the case that we were making, and that's why I was in Washington for the first week. The second week, I went to the National Academy of Sciences. This was the day before yesterday, and did a talk with them about misinformation. And this pertains to my kind of pro-science agenda for the environmental movement. And I was talking about misinformation in particular on GMOs, and a lot of what the environmental movement says and claims about the impacts of GMOs in some specific areas is as much misinformation as climate deniers or anti-vaxxers will be in those separate topics. So in fact, on the panel we had somebody who was an expert in misinformation about cancer, so all of the kind of pseudoscience that's put about for cancer remedies and the damage that does. Someone else who was a specialist in vaccines, someone else who was talking more about the corporate influence, so the way that big oil companies and other powerful actors have spread misinformation to reduce the scale of activity on climate change. And I was talking about misinformation by different actors, by environmentalists and others on GMOs. And this is part of the National Academies of Sciences consensus study. So it's a bit like the IPCC, but they do pull together huge amounts of data, and they're writing a consensus study, which is aiming to represent the state of the science on this topic of misinformation, which is a very live subject, and one that I've published peer-reviewed papers on myself. So that's the last couple of weeks. Now, I know you wanted to have a quick glimpse into the future of my 6 degrees stuff, and many of you may have seen the book already. I will see if I can make this work. I only need to go as far as 3 degrees in this, don't I? Because you're in a future here where you've got it's 2.5 degrees warmer, presumably above pre-industrial levels. So I don't even need to go to the end of this presentation, but this is my kind of standard boilerplate our final warning presentation. And just to preface that, like you just heard, this was a kind of a complete rewrite of my original 6 degrees book, which came out in 2007, and which oddly enough, people still come up to me and say that this book changed their life. Doesn't happen to me often. It doesn't happen to me with any of the other books, but it did happen with 6 degrees. So there was something at that time. It's probably the timing thing as much as anything, and also just the simplicity of how it's constructed. Because going through all of the literature, as you heard, there was hundreds, thousands of papers that I had to go through looking at the impacts of climate change, and structuring it in a degree by degree way gave it a strong narrative, because it's a reason to keep turning the pages, which you often don't get in a non-fiction book. And the reason I wrote the 2020 update, it was because people kept asking me whether I was more optimistic or more pessimistic in the kind of more than 10 years that's passed, 15 years since the research was done for the original book. And I didn't feel that was something which had a yes or no answer. The science has changed and evolved in lots of ways, and we, of course, have a lot more data than we did back then. Just to go through a few of the specifics. So we're now well over a degree hotter than we were in pre-industrial era, and we're heading rapidly towards 1.5, which is obviously the key goal that was agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015, was not crossing 1.5, and that's a central demand of the climate vulnerable countries as well. But this 1 degree makes it hotter than it has been since the previous interglacial. So throughout the whole of the Holocene, it's never been as warm as it is now, and you have to go back well over 100,000 years to find a climate on Earth which was as warm as the current temperatures are that we're experiencing. And probably the most significant impact of that we're seeing in the current world is the loss of the world's coral reefs. This is something I'm personally quite involved in trying to do something about. I'm just I've just helped set up, and I'm on the board of the Maldives Coral Institute. Now, the Maldives is like one of the most important coral reef countries in the world. Of course, the whole nation is built on coral reefs. That's what the islands are constructed of. That's how the islands are protected from the waves and from the winds and from the sea level rise. And also vitally important in terms of the ecology of the islands as well, because all of the plants and animals, to lesser or more extents, also are related to coral reefs. We've seen very large-scale episodes of coral bleaching due to the marine heat waves, which are happening more and more regularly. 1998 was really the big one. There was another big coral bleaching event in 2016, and there's another one predicted this year if El Nino takes off in the Pacific, which is what the models are currently showing. And so what we're trying to do really is to figure out if there's any way that we can increase the heat tolerance and adaptive capacity of corals in the oceans through really any desperate measures we can think of. There's scientists out there right now doing coral IVF work, where they're harvesting the spawn of some of the more tolerant corals and trying to grow them out into larvae and trying to reseed them on the coral reefs and stuff. We might even look at genetic engineering. We might look at importing corals from other places where the sea temperatures are already warmer, like in the Red Sea and stuff like that. But all of that is kind of, you know, snowflakes in the wind. It's grains of sand on a very large beach, because we're not going to be able to really do anything about the fact that 99% of the coral reefs are going to die off if we see the temperatures rise to anything close to 2 degrees. And we've already lost about half the world's coral, largely due to warming. And that's, of course, exacerbating the situation where many of the small island states are seeing increased rates of coastal erosion and the impacts of sea level rise. One of the first things I did when I was in Tuvalu and way back in 2002 was to paddle through the floodwaters that were coming up through the center of the island each time the high tides came up. We've seen recently again, this happened a couple of years ago, but it's happened more recently as well, that whole of the Greenland ice sheet's been within the melt zone, and that didn't used to happen. And we've seen very rapidly accelerating rates of melt off the Greenland ice cap, which of course are then running straight into the oceans, changing ocean circulation and also raising sea levels around the world too. I don't have to tell you about the loss of Arctic sea ice. That's something which is very familiar. We've just passed the point in the year when the sea ice is at its greatest extent, and there's been not nearly as much sea ice this year as would have otherwise been the case. I did think it was interesting to look at some of the figures actually of just to try and quantify the amount of heat that's now being additionally retained in the Earth system. Remember, most of the heat, because of the specific heat capacity of water as opposed to air, water holds a lot more heat than air, of course, and conducts it much more rapidly. So actually, if you want to see the impact of global heating in the Earth system, you need to look at the oceans, because that's where the heat's being retained. And it's, well, it was quantified recently as 6 zettajoules, which is 6 to the times 10 to the power of 21, which is a lot of zeros. And it's the same amount of heat as 3 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding in the oceans every second. That's a calculation that I did, by the way, so if you think it's wrong, talk to me. Now, I mentioned the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and the CVF was one of the groups of countries which was most involved in obtaining the 1.5 degree target at the Paris Agreement in 2015. And that's, of course, because these countries are in the front line and are most affected by the impacts of climate change and least able, have the least capacity to deal with it. There was a paper a couple of years ago, and I need to update these figures because we've now burned through a whole lot more carbon since then. But the point was that the carbon budget for staying below 1.5 is much less than the lifetime emissions from the infrastructure that we already have that uses fossil fuels. So if you add together all of the roads and the factories and the power stations and the cars and everything else that's going to burn fossil fuels that's already been built, that will already take us beyond the 1.5 degree target. So we'd have to close things down early. In particular, we have to close down coal-fired power stations. And indeed, that's one of the things which has irritated me on the nuclear issue. Germany, just this weekend, you probably saw on the news, closed down the last 3 nuclear power stations, which will result in, we've done some research on this, will result in an additional 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide hitting the atmosphere because they're keeping their coal plants running. And so this is the peculiar legacy of green anti-science, is closing down zero carbon infrastructure while leaving the highest fossil fuel source ever still on the grid. And again, that's one of the reasons why I've helped to co-found Replanet, which is a pro-science environmental group, to start to challenge the movement to move in a more pro-science direction. There was an IPCC report about 1.5, which quantified all the differential impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is pretty useful. Here's just a few of the numbers from it. It talked about 65 million more people exposed to exceptional heat waves. We will see the total disappearance of the Arctic sea ice sometime in the 2030s, if not sooner. Additional 10 million more people flooded by rising sea levels. I mentioned before about 99% of the world's coral reefs. 0.5 million additional malnutrition deaths by 2050. That isn't actually that many compared to things like COVID, but I think that really does depend on a lot of other factors. So we can talk more about agriculture later. And one of the big things which concerns people is about the melt of permafrost across the Arctic as well, and that potentially being a tipping point. So if I just skip forward actually and talk about the ecology, I think it's really important to remember that we share this planet with a lot of other plants and animals. Humans are just one species among many, and the adaptive capacity of human society and humankind is, I think, going to be much greater than that of natural ecosystems, which have evolved over millions of years into climate spaces which are no longer going to exist within a matter of decades. And so this has been modeled, and by about 2 degrees, plants, insects, and amphibians lose a third of their naturally adapted climatic habitat. And so you would expect that to feed through into a loss of diversity and potential increase in the numbers of extinctions as well. And just to go back to the permafrost issue, 6 million square kilometers of Arctic permafrost thawing means a lot more methane and carbon dioxide hitting the atmosphere. And over time, this is one of the feedback mechanisms which could potentially accelerate climate change way beyond 2 degrees. Remember, there's a long time lag in all of these systems. So it takes a long time to melt ice. It takes a long time for that to release carbon, and for that carbon then to manifest as additional warming and then melt more ice. So it isn't like this happens in a matter of years, like you might hear from some of the more alarming statements. But it's a legacy which is going to be very difficult for planets to deal with over many decades and centuries. That's certainly the case. In terms of the carbon budget for 2 degrees, we're getting close, even with the amount of fossil fuels that we already know about. And it does mean that we have to hit net zero by mid-century. So we have to get to zero globally by 2050, which means about 6% cuts per year, which of course we're nowhere near on at the moment. So you mentioned 2.5 degrees. That's a fairly optimistic case, and it really depends now on what the big emitting countries do. And by big emitting, I don't just mean the US and Europe now. It's really China and India and some of the big developing countries that have to make the decisions about whether we get to 2 degrees or whether we go somewhere higher. I will give you, 2.5 in my scale comes in the 3 degree world, because I'm talking about above pre-industrial. So anything between 2 or 3 degrees is my 3 degree world. So just to run you through some of the impacts of that. I do find the geology interesting of this, because it gives you a kind of a contextual sense of scale of how unusual and how unprecedented the climate situation is that we'll be heading into, and how quickly it's happening. So 3 degree temperature takes us hotter than any time since the Pliocene, which is about 3 to 5 million years ago, which is about when modern humans started evolving. So there weren't anatomically modern humans in the Pliocene, but some of our great ape ancestors are already around. but it does, that does mean that this temperature is outside the entire evolutionary experience of Homo sapiens, which is interesting. And to have this happen, I mean, previously climate changes have happened geologically rapidly, which means over thousands of years, but we're doing this over decades, and that's probably fairly unprecedented in the Earth system, certainly from an already warm baseline of an interglacial. This is I think probably the Atlas Mountains, but this is what the Alps would look like in a 3-degree world. We're already seeing dramatic losses in snow cover, and I think I read in the papers this morning that the Alps lost about 6% of their ice in one year in last summer. So it's, extrapolate that forward, and there's going to be a dramatic reduction in the glacial cover of the Alps. I don't think there'll be much glacial ice left at all, and that affects the hydrology of the river systems and affects a whole number of things. And of course, it's not just the Alps; it's the Andes, the Himalaya, many other mountain areas which are the primary sources for some of the world's most important rivers, and are very important for agriculture and for freshwater resources as well, of course. One of the clearest impacts of climate warming, as you might expect, is heat waves. There's about a 500% increase in drought projected, affecting a third of the world's land area with deadly heat waves, which is a very specific scientific meaning. That means heat waves which are sufficiently outside the adaptive capacity to cause mass death, particularly if they are what's called wet bulb temperatures, and that's something that comes later on in the projections, where you actually get temperatures and humidities which are so high that you can't shed heat by sweating anymore. So it essentially becomes a lethal environment to be outside in these temperatures, and that affects more and more of the kind of tropics and subtropics in South Asia, Middle East, and also areas of China, Indonesia, places like that. Some very populated countries are potentially affected by that. We'll see the desertification as well of Italy, Spain, Greece, those parts of the world too. And sea level rise, which is probably something you want to talk about more for Rotterdam. Up to 2 meters I've put here by the end of the century. Sea level rise is it's a very long-term thing, and so there will always be ways to mitigate against it and adapt to it. And in certain places, you can, in Maldives already, the new islands that they've built for the airport and for the new sort of suburban areas of the capital, they've already made 2 meters higher. So those are resilient for another century or so, simply by the amount of aggregates that they put on the island as a sort of baseline for how you build the houses. There's also plans for floating islands, and they can make the built infrastructure more flood tolerant, so that water can come in and go away again, and it doesn't have to be so devastating. I was talking about GMOs earlier, weren't you? And that's one of the primary adaptive opportunities that we have for crop plants, of course, as well, is if we can make the world's crops more climate tolerant, whether it's droughts or whether it's heat, then we can potentially protect harvests going forward as well. If we don't have those opportunities, then we're going to see a more rapid decline in the yields of staple crops due to climate warming. Some of the tipping points, and this is something which has been written about recently. The Amazon rainforest is particularly vulnerable, not just because of the direct climate impacts, of course, but because it's already been so very large scale deforestation, primarily for agriculture, cattle ranching, the whole story, and because the tropical forest in Amazon depends on itself to generate its own rainfall. As you remove more and more of the forest, that potentially can tip into a kind of drought situation where the forest eventually burns down. And this is not a fire adapted forest, so it's not like Australia where they're used to burning. But once it burns over entirely, it might well not come back. I've talked about the permafrost, but there's a lot more also in that. And one of the interesting issues is the albedo of the planet will change as you remove ice. So the ice, of course, is very shiny. It has a very high reflectivity. And so if you remove that in the summer months, particularly where it really matters, it doesn't matter in the winter because there's no sunlight coming anyway. But in the summer, the darker surface of the ocean absorbs a lot more of the sun's heat. So that basically puts more heat into the Earth system, and that's a very important feedback mechanism. It's pretty much the reverse of what happens when you go into an ice age. So we know these feedback mechanisms have operated before in the planet system with regard to albedo and ice coverage. Well, I won't go into 4 degrees because that's your scenario, but it's, you know, it's kind of ultimate ending in a kind of mass extinction and civilizational collapse. So I think we won't go there because this isn't the world we're going to talk about. It's worth, I don't know if I have a slide for this or not. I'll just check. Do I have, because I want to just go through the actual latest situation we're in. Oh yeah, I could try this one. The latest situation we're in with regard to the projections of where we currently are going to be. So this might be a little bit out of date. November, yeah, it's not changed a whole lot though. So look at Climate Action Tracker if you're interested in the latest. I mean, the only reason it's not changed much is because there hasn't really been any increase in ambition since this point. India has now come up with a net zero target for 2070. Most of the industrialized world is at 2050. And it depends really on whether you believe the countries are going to achieve these net zero targets or not. You know, if you look at your government, you look at your society, and you think, is this happening? Is this transitioning happening fast enough to meet these targets? I think a lot of countries are going to struggle. There's a lot of pushback already on policies like stopping, you know, in the EU, the Germans were pushing back very strongly on whether they could stop selling internal combustion engine cars. Essential to do that very quickly for achieving any net zero target, because, you know, once cars are manufactured, they have a lifetime of 20 plus years. And so they'll still be burning oil in 20 years from whenever they get sold. So you've got to stop selling them, and you've got to move to a zero carbon transport fleet really quickly. 2030 being the latest, I think. Anyway, so if you look at what the government's currently doing, that gives you about 2.7. If you put all of the pledges and targets together, it's about 2 degrees. So, you know, when I started working on my 6 degrees book, that was just as much a realistic scenario as any, because we were looking at possibly increasing fossil fuel emissions throughout the whole of the 21st century. You know, there was the really high projections for climate impacts depend on us continuing to burn more and more coal all the way through the next 100 years. Now, I think that's really, really unlikely now. I mean, it's possible that coal and fossil fuels are already peaking globally now. That's a long way from net zero by 2050, but you've got to peak to start the downward path, and it's very different from carrying on going up and up and up. So I'm moderately optimistic. If I was to take a guess, I think we're probably somewhere between 2.4 and 2.1 in terms of where we're going to end up by 2100. And so, yeah, build just that's my guess, and I'd build your sort of scenarios on that, and just remember the time differential about these things. So it makes a big difference, you know, a very rapid impact of such as heat or extreme weather, as opposed to a much longer term one like sea level rise. Okay, so I hope it's useful. I will stop talking now, and we can discuss whatever it is you want to discuss.
Story, yeah. I'm sure there's questions. Well, just to start, you were talking about the Maldives before, and I think taking this sort of global perspective is maybe, all of the greatest importance. Now, what you're describing of all these planned infrastructures that will be fossil fuel based, and mainly in Indonesia and India, maybe also China, I think that's sort of a disaster, that going to happen, because we will be stuck with fossil fuels for the next 20, 30 years. Do you think that what you said, who owes who, also applies there, that the West should maybe more engage with these big infrastructures on different places in the world instead of that we all insulate our windows?
I mean, look, insulating your windows is how you get to net zero in the Netherlands and in the UK and in colder climates. So it's important that we don't waste energy and that we move to a zero carbon approach in all areas of the economy. And that's not, it's not even, you know, we don't even know that that's possible yet. You know, there's no net zero opportunity technologically for aviation at the moment that I know about or which I believe in. Electricity we can certainly do with a combination of renewables and nuclear. Surface transport, electric cars, I think are certainly going to be 100% of the way forward. Shipping less so. Agriculture is really difficult. There's emissions of other greenhouse gases, of course, methane, nitrous oxides that come from agriculture. We're going to have to eat a lot less meat. If we switch to a kind of what I would call a modern vegan diet, which isn't just lentils and stuff, but actually includes alternative proteins made through precision fermentation using microbes, which is lots of new startup companies doing this now, where you can actually get real cheese, you know, the same proteins as meat, milk, that kind of stuff, which people really like because we're evolved to like these things. Then I think we can free up a lot of land space, and with rewilding and reforestation, we can move at least the land into a net positive situation where we're absorbing carbon. But there's a long way to go in all these areas, and we get a lot of pushback. I mean, you've seen the farmers in the Netherlands have violently objected even just to nitrogen. And nitrogen is important, by the way, but it's important in different ways. It interacts only in certain different ways with climate. So dealing with the greenhouse gas cost of farming and livestock in particular is going to be a real challenge. Looking at, well, China is a different issue because China already has most of the world's money, so they don't need our financial help. But the least developed countries and countries like the Maldives, Bangladesh, working with Ghana, Kenya, they do need inward investment. So this is a money thing at the moment. They need things like, you know, this isn't normally what environmentalists talk about, but we need to talk about reducing the cost of capital. We need to talk about loan guarantees. We need to talk about, you know, the cost of power purchasing agreements in the electricity sector. These are actually the practical stuff which is going to make a difference on the ground to how these countries develop, whether they develop using fossil fuels or whether they can move in a cleaner direction. And if we want them, not, you know, they want to achieve our lifestyles in terms of the prosperity that we've achieved. That's non-negotiable. I can't go to the government of Kenya or Bangladesh and say you have to stay poor. I mean, I wouldn't even be in the room, and I wouldn't be in the country for much longer either. So that's non-negotiable. What the only thing that you can really affect, or at least assist them in, is ensuring that their achievement of prosperity is also compatible with the trend towards net zero. And so in the CVF, we're working on what we call climate prosperity plans, and there's a name for that specific reason. These countries want prosperity, but they also want a safe climate. So what are the investment opportunities? How do you actually move forward with different technologies that mean that these countries have a clean growth trajectory, not a dirty one? And that does involve, I think, a recognition of the historical responsibilities for climate warming. You know, the developed world is right in the lead. The US is very high up on the historical responsibilities, and even the per capita emissions are still very different. So, I mean, the per capita emissions of China are now higher than ours, but they weren't until fairly recently. So China's historical responsibility is still rough. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but it's not much higher than, it's probably still lower than Europe's or America's.
What you mentioned something earlier about the measures to protect the coral reefs against further bleaching. Are there other ways that we can protect or save ecosystems within against the results of climate of the heating up of the planet?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we're talking about the heating of the planet that we absolutely can't prevent. So what's already in the pipeline, and what is, within the realms of what's possible. Like Extinction Rebellion will say we need to be carbon zero by 2025 in 2 years' time, but there's no plan for achieving that, which doesn't involve you'd have to. It's like, to take a COVID analogy, it's like the difference between lockdown and a vaccination. Vaccinations take time, and lockdown might stop transmission, but it does involve stopping everything, stopping a whole economy, stopping seeing people, stopping flying, all of that stuff. So you could do it, but the cost of that on our societies is unthinkable, and I don't think people would tolerate it politically. And so you'd end up with a backlash, which would mean the whole thing just gets thrown away. That people simply will not tolerate the level of ambition which the more extreme environmental activists are calling for. However, so that's why there's a certain amount of warming which is going to be in the system we can't do anything about. That's your kind of 2 degrees plus. How can ecosystems adapt to that? Well, they need space primarily. Habitat loss is still the #1 driver of ecological harm and biodiversity loss, and that still primarily comes from agriculture. And so the most important thing that we can do, and I've campaigned for this with Replanet, is to use much less livestock, and to rewild a large fraction of our land. But the 30% target was agreed recently at the biodiversity COP. I think 50% would be sensible for rewilding, and is compatible with a kind of modern vegan diet, at least. So we don't all have to go hungry. What we can't do is continue with the romantic stuff like organic farming, agroecology, all of this sort of stuff, which a lot of the environmental movement still talks about, because that involves using very large amounts of land and has a much lower wildlife value than pure rewilding. Like most species, there are some species which are adapted as farmland species, certain birds, butterflies, plants and stuff. But actually, when you're talking about actual functional ecosystems, you need large predators, you need large herbivores, you need all of the different trophic levels which don't exist on any kind of farmland. And so that's why rewilding, I think, is a much more important objective to have, to protect what remains of the planet's ecology. The problem with coral reefs is that it's already gone too far. Even if you remove the direct stressors, the overfishing, plastic, nutrient pollution and stuff from coral reefs, they still seem to bleach. And the more they bleach, the less likely they are to come back and survive. And so that's why we're looking at really just emergency measures, most of which probably aren't going to work. I don't think doing GMO corals is likely to work. I don't think most of the stuff that we're doing at the moment is likely to work, or even if it does, it'll be on a tiny, tiny scale. But no one's figured out at all how we can scale up adaptive capacity of coral reefs. And so, the upshot for me is you can't micromanage this at an ecological level. All you can do really is try and remove as much of the stress as you can, and allow ecosystems the space and to adapt as rapidly as is possible within their own genetics and their own evolutionary capacity.
I have a question as well. Hello, Mark. Is it
Hi.
close enough?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Argentina, and currently there's a discussion about how to exchange climate debt, like the national debt that is against the IMF in terms of climate responsibility. You mentioned it a bit in the beginning, and I wanted to ask what do you think are the current struggles to enforce that kind of policies, or is it just a statement, or is it actually something that can come true?
No, it's a real thing, and it's something I know about because I was, writing speeches and lobbying for this last week in Washington, D.C. TNC, which is the Nature Conservancy, has put a lot of time into doing debt climate swaps. They've already done deals with the Seychelles, Barbados, Ecuador is in the offing now. That looking at, this is broader than just climate. This is debt for nature swaps. So basically, what happens is that you buy out, you find a new consortium which will buy out some of the existing commercial debt at a lower rate, so much lower than the face value of the debt. And so that delivers what you call a haircut, where the creditors have to take a write down on the amount of debt which is out there, in return for which the country agrees I mean, in the case of the Seychelles, it was about doing marine protected areas so that to reduce the fishing pressure and to better protect the marine ecosystem. But for a more climate approach, we've argued at the CBF that doing debt climate swaps to help fund climate prosperity plans, so to get more renewable infrastructure into countries like Sri Lanka and Ghana, which are currently facing crippling debt situations, would be something that the creditors might look at. The problem is that a lot of the debt out there is owed to China. And China really isn't interested in this stuff. They're not interested in forgiving any of the debts at the moment. So the bilateral creditors, the different countries, and also the multilateral creditors, the World Bank and the IMF themselves, are much less tractable. So it's a really complicated thing. I'm not a finance person, and I'm not sure about the scalability of this. It's only one type of debt which can be addressed through debt climate swaps as they're currently designed, but it's certainly something looking into. And back in the 90s, I mean, you're probably not old enough, but we had what was called HIPIC, which was the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which did reduce a lot of the debts of poorer countries at that time. And I do think it's worth looking at a kind of grand climate debt swap across a lot of the world's poorer countries. And that might be something which we can, I'll see about pushing that at the next COP, because I think we need to up the scale of the ambition on this issue.
I have a question, if it's okay. Now, I was wondering, there's a lot of voices, of course, in this whole discussion that raise promises that technology is going to fix quite a lot of our issues, right? So we can still consume the same amount of energy as long as we move into some kind of nuclear fusion reactor, and then we can sustain it for the same lifestyle for a long period of time. And I was wondering, how do you view that? How do you look at this? On the one hand, the role of technological developments that can help us making the transition, but at the other hand, that they will also maybe prevent us from really making the fundamental changes that are needed to take. If you understand my question.
I completely understand your question. I mean, the question I have is, when you say the fundamental changes that we need to take, what are those? Can you try and be more specific about what the things are that are?
Well, I can imagine that part of it is, for example, what you mentioned is we have to eat less meat. We have to find a way to reduce our impact on the Earth systems, emit less CO2, but also nitrogen. Like all this, fly less maybe. Really fundamentally reorganize our lives so that the impact will become less. Or at least that's what I have a feeling that we need to do. But that there's a lot of promises are being made by politicians, by big companies, that say like, no, you can keep the same lifestyle as you have it right now because technology is going to solve everything.
Well, look, I'll be honest with you. My view on this is that everything that technology doesn't solve won't get solved. You're not going to be able to persuade any countries or any populations to adopt lifestyle choices which are experienced by them as a reduction in their standard of living. Okay, so this is why, I mean, that's my COVID analogy. It's the lockdown versus the vaccine. The vaccine is the technological shift. We have to wait for it, and it has to work, and that's something which only science can determine. With when it comes to COVID, there was a whole new technology invented of mRNA vaccines. I don't know how much you know about the biology of this, but there's a whole healthcare revolution coming down the line now because we better understand the genetics of viruses, and we're better able to combat them using technologies which barely existed a decade ago, and by the way, which most of the environmental movement opposed. Having genetically engineered vaccines to save us from a global pandemic was something which would have surprised me back when I was an anti-GMO activist 20 years ago. But you live and learn, and I'd say the same for aviation. I've just flown. You probably fly. I bet everyone in that room has flown at some point relatively recently and would plan to do so again. If you shake your head, then that's great. But if you have family on the other side of the planet and they're getting married, or your kids want to travel or anything like that, this is the world we're living in. And so you can't ask people to, I mean, only a tiny, and you know, we've done polls on this. It's really undeniable that only a tiny fraction of the world's population would do a lifestyle change, a sacrificial lifestyle change, despite the fact that would be one way to solve the problem. If you're able to, as happened in COVID, shut down the world's aviation industry, then fine, you can eliminate 3% of the world's greenhouse gas budget at a stroke. But that also does mean you dismantle the whole globalized infrastructure of the modern civilization, essentially, at the same time. We've built globalized economies which fundamentally depend on rapid large-scale travel. And so a more practical and a more pragmatic approach to doing this, which is more likely to work, which is what I care about. If you want to save the coral reefs, you want to do what's going to work, is to find ways to decarbonize it. Now, there isn't a solution for aviation at the moment, which is why I think we should reduce the amount that we have incentives for flying and try to keep it as low a level as possible, because you can't put a nuclear reactor onto a plane. Biofuels don't work; they're not scalable. Hydrogen doesn't work either; the physics isn't right. So there isn't something I'm currently aware of which is going to decarbonize aviation. But let's at least focus on the more easy things to do. To decarbonize the electricity grid, we need to switch off all the coal-fired power stations in Europe within the next 10 years. That doesn't mean switching off nuclear like the idiot Germans did. It does mean that we have to be realistic about the physics. Fusion, you mentioned, fusion is not going to work in my view. The physics fusion is not right. I'd love to talk about it because it fascinates me. Fission does work. That's been working since 1944. It's given us some very effective bombs and it's given us some very effective reactors. Fusion is a different matter. The only way that fusion does work is in the hydrogen bomb, by the way, or in the sun. You're not going to be able to make reactors which deliver anything, you know, anything useful in terms of electrical production even within this century. I don't think so. Like, you know, a lot of people will cite things like that and say, well, technology isn't going to save us because, well, it has to be the right technology. It has to work. You know, it can't be imaginary, and it can't fly in the face of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics like a lot of the promises are that are made for fusion. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, we need to eat less meat. The vegans have been saying this for 20 years, and how many people are vegan? It's still less than 1 or 2%. There's been a big increase, but that's because you've got shifts now in technology which allow better proteins to be developed, which make veganism more attractive. You know, there's companies out there, I've visited some of them, which are making cheese proteins, whey and chymosin and things like that, which, you know, make, you know, I don't know if you've ever tried vegan cheeses, but they're all shit. They're made of palm oil, coconut oil, they taste like shit, they don't have a nice mouthfeel, you know. And so if you can make cheeses with the right proteins, but just not using the livestock, using microorganisms, then you can have your cake and eat it essentially, and that's the promise. That's the promise that technology offers. I don't think there's any fundamental physical reason why we can't have modern high energy civilization on a fully ecologically restored and protected planet with minimal levels of climate change. So that's my, you know, that's important for me to say that because that's my philosophy, and it's as much a kind of ideological philosophy. So I'm an eco-modernist and eco-optimist, and there's a lot of people out there who are eco-pessimists who would say more like the second part of your question, that we need to fundamentally change things and that modern civilization is fundamentally incompatible with ecological life support systems. I don't believe that, but I think it's a debate that which will continue and which there isn't a right and a wrong answer to, but which I think science has a lot to offer on as well. So, you know, founding Replanet as a science-led environmental group, it's like, what we're saying is we will listen to the evidence if that means we have to change a position on something. You could never change the position of Greenpeace on nuclear power because it's part of their ideological DNA, never mind what the evidence says, and the evidence is very clear on that. And so what I'm saying is that I think we should change our positions in response to scientific evidence. I think that's really important as a way of solving problems. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but you know, you've got more of my.
Actually changed your position quite a bit in comparison to 20 years ago. You seem like a very practical person, also looking for practical solutions to reach the goal, and you changed from, well, I would say action and violence to information and science, right? And if you talk about what is most effective, of course we're a group of historians, architects, designers here, looking for a way to be effective with the means that we have at our disposal. So could you say something about that, in light of your own development?
I mean, I was just a little bit triggered by violence. I mean, I've never been an advocate of violence.
Have destroyed these fields, these trial fields of GMO. That's kind of violence against plants, right?
Well, I mean, eating a carrot is violent against plants. I mean, I'm talking about non-violent, what they call non-violent direct action, which is a whole thing in you know, what Extinction Rebellion do, or Fridays for Future, or any of the more radical groups, is non-violent direct action, which means you can certainly take direct action against property, but you can't harm life. At least you can't harm sentient life. I don't think plants are included in that. In not at least in that way, maybe as a kind of as ecologies, but not as individuals. So no, I've always been an advocate of non-violent direct action. I'm not a pacifist. I mean, it's interesting because we're having a debate in Replanet at the moment about to what extent we can support the resistance in Ukraine against Russian aggression, and some of our Eastern European kind of members, like in Poland and Sweden and Finland, are very keen to support militarily. Which would be a big shift for an environmental group to do that. Like, you can't imagine Greenpeace sending sending guns to Ukraine, which, by the way, isn't what's suggested. But it is an important challenge to our philosophy. You know, I believe that we as countries should support should support militarily the Ukrainians against Russian aggression. So how do you then, you know, how do you then bring that into your work as an environmentalist or as an environmental group, which is an interesting thing. But I mean, I'm a historian, by the way, by training, so I share that with perhaps some of your members. I did politics and modern history, and so for me, I try and be as much of a polymath as possible, and maintain an interest in lots of different areas and work in lots of different areas. So I'm not just working on climate. I'm writing a book on nuclear war at the moment, which is really fascinating, and I think is a much bigger risk to it's a much greater threat in terms of civilizational collapse than anything else. Much worse than climate change, much worse even than AI or pandemics, because nuclear war can destroy our whole civilization in about half an hour and give us a 10-year nuclear winter where pretty much all the world's population will starve. Now, that isn't on anyone's radar as a climate change impact, because it's much, much slower, and because it's slower, there's many more ways we can adapt or make it less bad. So I think it's also important to maintain some kind of sense of context about these things, and it gives you also, you know, a bit more of an insight into the gravity of the different challenges that we face.
I don't know if you can hear me.
And if you say loudly.
Okay. Well, I want to go back maybe to China's role in this new rare earth mining, the cobalt, etc. Because China is sitting on the biggest reservoir at the moment, perhaps. But how would you assess this new direction that Europe is taking? It's driving the idea of mining in, for example, Sweden recently, and what is your assessment and idea on this impact and the direction that we're heading?
If you want wind power, you will have to mine in Sweden. That's my view on this. And I challenge the environmentalists that the most small, like the least ecologically impactful way of generating energy is nuclear. You know, uranium is a tiny thing. You know, you can just a golf ball size of uranium can deliver your entire lifetime's high energy in a modern country as per person. And so the mining of that and the impacts at every level, whether it's land use or any concrete or anything else, is tiny compared to all of the other options, including renewables. You know, the renewable transition will mean a lot more rare earth, as you mentioned, lithium, which isn't a rare earth, but you're going to have to mine a lot more of that. Copper, high voltage cables, all of this infrastructure, which will be necessary for net zero, has to come from somewhere. China is not sitting on the reservoirs of these minerals. They just have the manufacturing at the moment. So cobalt's mostly coming from DRC, where some of it's mined by children and others in really horrific conditions. And cobalt's currently important in lithium-ion batteries. All of your iPhones have got cobalt in, and laptops and everything else, as I'm sure you know. And electric cars, my electric car has a cobalt in, the same as yours probably do as well. So there's different issues here. We have to try and make the supply chains as respectful of human rights as is possible and as ecologically benign as possible. But there is going to be a big increase in mining as a result of this, because these are all new. All these new technologies require a lot more new materials, and it's going to have to come from somewhere. I don't see why it should only be the global south that suffers the burden of this. But you know, in the longer term, we need to try to integrate recycling into this. Like the first generations of wind turbines were not recyclable; they're using carbon fiber, you know, which was intended for landfill. There's no real recycling integrated into the current battery technology packs either. So even though they've got really valuable minerals in them, they're aiming just to be thrown away. And we can't have a one-through, you know, approach to this, you know, indefinitely, because that's clearly not sustainable. So we need to make sure that the new technologies which help get us to net zero do integrate a kind of circular economy approach to them from the outset. That needs to be mandated in when these technologies are being invented and scaled up, rather than something which is just added later on, which has already been the case with wind and solar. Solar, by the way, solar panels also are not recyclable, and so we need, you know, they have to be materials that we can reuse, rather than going out and mining new stuff all the time.
Any other question?
I have a question about the nuclear energy that will it be simply too late, because if you want to scale up more nuclear plants, it takes sometimes 10 or more years, sometimes 15 or 20 years before you have ready one of them. And I have the feeling that it's too late if we just we try to rely on nuclear energy.
Can I add something on this topic? I come from France, so from a very nuclear country, and in the last 2 summers we had serious problems with the drought on the rivers, and all nuclear plants are like cooled by the rivers, and now there's just basically not enough water for making the nuclear plants function all the time. I wonder in general how this reliance on technology isn't a weakness, considering that we know that there'll be more and more disasters and extreme climate events, and what's your view on it?
Yeah, no, thank you. I could talk on the nuclear thing for another hour, because I find it endlessly fascinating, and it's something I've done a lot of work on. Remember, nuclear fission isn't one single technology. There's lots and lots of different types of ways in which you can fission, not just uranium, but thorium as well, and of course plutonium if you're on a fast reactor cycle. I would encourage you to check out my report, Water Waste, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of an intellectual exercise more than anything, where I looked at the amount of uranium that there is currently in the spent fuel reserves, which is categorized as nuclear waste. And so I actually ran the numbers on this, just looking really at the fundamental physics, and I worked out that you could run Europe at current electricity demand for about 1,000 years just using the existing nuclear waste. So I think it's important to see these things not as a horrible toxic legacy which needs to be put underground, but something which can be fully reused. 95% of the energy is still in the spent fuel, which they're currently categorizing as waste, which I think is not compatible with a circular economy approach. Having said that, the new reactor designs do need to move forward much more quickly. I mean, your questioner there said about 20 years. I mean, because something might not be done for 20 years doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Remember, net zero is 2050. So in 2050, we still need it. We need zero carbon power. And if we don't start doing it now, then it's not going to get done. But a lot of the holdup is regulation, and a lot of the regulation is an undue burden. You know, even the new generation of SMRs, the Nuclear Regulatory Committee in the US has like 1,000 pages of regulations that these have to abide by, which you might think is fine for safety reasons, but it's also an undue burden, because there's much higher safety regulations applicable to nuclear than there are to any other industry. I mean, coal, and I keep going on about coal because it's clearly bad, kills 1 million or so people through the particulates that go up its chimneys every single year, and we just accept that as a burden on society. For nuclear, the radiation has to be lower in a nuclear plant than even exists naturally in many parts of the world, because the regulations are that stringent, and there's an assumption that even low levels of radiation potentially raise a risk of cancer, which is not supported by science, by anything we know scientifically. There's been very long-term studies of the atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also people who live in higher radiation parts of the world, in Iran and Brazil and places, which don't show any increase in the risk of cancer at relatively low levels of radiation, such as you get from a normally operating nuclear power plant. And even from Fukushima, which did release quite a lot of radiation, there's no provable radiation deaths. So these are, we've been through a pandemic which just killed 15 million people, and it's an absolute catastrophe. And the death tolls are off the scale compared to what we are prepared to accept in other areas. And so, this comes back to our kind of sense of we get risk wrong as both as individuals and as a society. Like the Germans think the risk of nuclear is higher than the risk of coal. They're completely wrong about that by any stretch of scientific understanding. In the same way that people who are concerned about vaccinations get the risk wrong. They think the risk is higher of putting a needle in their arms as opposed to the risk of getting COVID and living with the impacts of that. And there's lots of different reasons for that. There's lots of different psychological triggers which make people experience nuclear radiation as a fear thing, and other, pollution from cars is not a fear thing. For example, you're much less likely to get cancer if you live in the Fukushima exclusion zone than if you live in the center of a modern city which has car traffic in it. But it doesn't feel the same way, right? And so our sort of psychological or even societal understanding of risk is way out of proportion. And this feeds through into climate risk, of course. The risk we have of climate damages through keeping fossil fuels on the grid are much, much higher than any risk we'd have from even a moderate increase in the amount of nuclear accidents. And the only accident which is provably causing death is Chernobyl, of course. And even that was probably a few thousand over many decades. So it's a pretty small, even in terms of the standards of industrial accidents. So, and that's a risk. I think if we have more nuclear power, there will be nuclear accidents for sure. Everything goes wrong. Planes fall out of the sky, but we carry on flying. So we have to accept a certain level of risk for any technology that we're going to, or anything we're going to do. Not adopting a technology also has a risk, and that's my point. Not adopting nuclear has a much higher risk than adopting nuclear, even given accidents and radiation releases.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it was about, I mean, I
Yeah, you have
guess,
to come a little bit closer.
Yeah, sorry.
It's really hard.
yeah, no, I guess the answer is that, there'll be so an amount of risk, and sometimes there'll be nuclear accident in a climate with more extreme events, etc.
No, I think nuclear power stations can be fairly hardened to climate risks. I mean, look what's going on at Zaporizhzhia at the moment, where the Russians have occupied a nuclear power plant. They've shelled it with artillery. They've cut off all of the power. They've tortured most of the staff that's working in the station, and it's still able to survive because these are relatively well protected technologies, and newer generations will have what's called passive safety as well. If they choose to design those things in, where you can literally just walk away from it and it'll start to cool down and won't explode. You mentioned think about France and about heating up rivers and stuff. That's not an issue if they're on the sea and they're on the coastline. I mean, as I understand it, the main issue there is about raising river temperatures and that having an ecological burden, as opposed to an actual threat to the operation of the nuclear power station itself. But this applies, by the way, to all thermal power, so it applies to coal as well, anything which uses the steam cycle. But you can also now get air-cooled systems which don't need water. And many of the new reactor designs aren't water-cooled either. It's complicated, and I'd encourage you to look into it. But I don't think that's a significant risk, really. I don't think climate risk is a significant risk to the deployment of nuclear, any more than changing wind patterns are a risk to deploying wind power. I think these things are fairly small and completely manageable.
Maybe.
I don't know if you can hear me from here, but since we're talking about energy, I read that China is now producing solar panels, and they actually produce most of the world's solar panels. and the raw material costs are going down quite significantly, and now solar panels are becoming quite cheap. So, and also Europe is buying almost half of the solar panels that they produce. Do you think in the future there will be a shift, at least in Europe, to also use this kind of like renewable energy as like main source of energy production? Or how do you think this will change how energy?
I mean, the fact that China makes most of the world's solar panels, and it's at least 80% or something, is a reflection of the whole shifting of global manufacturing capacity to China. I mean, we in the West don't make anything, ever. We don't make computers, we don't make our own clothes. We literally don't make anything. You know, even building a bridge or building new buildings or something is prohibitively expensive. I mean, you find a large infrastructure project in Europe or North America that has not gone 5 times over budget in the last 10 years. And they have all of the permitting issues. In Germany, they've got real problems at the moment, even transmitting the new renewable power to the places where it's needed, because no one will accept having high voltage lines across the land. So, and that's kind of a NIMBY problem, but it's the same for any new infrastructure, whether it's like, you know, high-speed rail lines in the UK, that was hugely opposed as well, and so on and so forth. But like, the problem with solar in China has been about the situation in Xinjiang as well. So a lot of at least some of the manufacturing, we don't really know, but some of it's essentially been slave labor. So the solar, this big solar boom that we've had, you know, why is it so cheap? Well, because they're using slaves to make it. You know, that's not good in my book. And even over the last few years, the price reduction in solar has basically stopped. There's not been any price reduction. I don't think it's going to go much lower. This isn't like the Moore's law for making computers or transistors and things. It's not going to go much lower because there's fundamental limits to how cheap you can make, you know, silicon panels. I mean, this is or all the different rare earths and stuff. This is, you know, this is about engineering as much as anything.
Any other burning questions? No, because otherwise, yeah, I would like to thank you, Mark, and yeah, for this amazing sharing of knowledge and ideas with us. I think it will give us enough to go on for the next part of the workshop and for the next time. So thanks again, and good luck with your endeavors, and especially with the book. It's for such a topic, it's maybe strange to say that I'm looking forward to it.
Do you have a title yet?
Nuclear bombs.
The nuclear war book?
Yes.
So I've called it, I mean, this is maybe a temporary title, I've called it 6 Minutes to Winter.
Okay. The reason for that is because we only know this from the US side. We don't really know about how Russians make decisions, for obvious reasons. Like the US president has about 6 minutes after the initial report of an incoming missile salvo to decide whether to launch ICBMs in response. So you have 6 minutes to decide whether to destroy the whole world, essentially. And winter, in that sense, is the nuclear winter, where the smoke, basically what happens in nuclear winter is that the smoke from the burning cities goes up into the stratosphere and circulates the globe for about 10 years. It's actually fully dark, probably for the first 2 years. So no photosynthesis at all, well below freezing in all continental areas of like where we live. And if you look at the food projection, you literally can't produce any food. And so virtually the entire populations of all of our countries would die.
Relieved after your answer that technology is kind of a solution, but now I'm depressed again.
Well, that's not a technology challenge. I mean, this is the game theory thing. I mean, the technology, maybe it is in the sense that nuclear weapons were invented, but they were always going to be invented once we had any understanding of atomic physics. I mean, that became clear in the 1930s, and Rutherford, or whoever it was, said, let's not even go there and look at the neutron chain reaction because of where it's going to lead up. And the Germans, of course, were well down the path towards atomic weapons. Unfortunately, didn't complete it. And it was Einstein and others who said, we need to get this before the Germans do, and use it to win the war, ultimately in Japan with horrific civilian casualties. But technology can also eliminate this. Like we can burn up, if we get to a situation, as I hope we will, where we can eliminate all of the nuclear weapons that are currently held, the way to do that will be to burn them up in nuclear reactors and generate power with them. There was a program and this is the positive note to end on, there was a program in the 1990s called megatons to megawatts. So after the Cold War, a lot of the spare Soviet nuclear weapons were repurposed into nuclear fuel and taken into reactors where they generated huge amounts of carbon-free power in the United States. And I think we should aim at doing that with all of the world's nuclear weapons, hopefully sooner rather than later, because this is a risk which we really can't continue to tolerate.
Oh, thanks for this optimistic note to end on.
Yeah.
So thanks again, and yeah, hope to stay in touch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, was it?